Good evening. My name is Malika Bussey, and I'm the Family Community Engagement Coordinator for the South Yuba Lyndhurst Schools, servicing K 12. Joining me this evening is Mr. Ricky Powers, who is one of our youth development specialists here in the South Yuba Lyndhurst Schools, whose office is located at Memorial Junior High. However, he does serve our district K 12 as well. To our parents and those that are watching, thank you for joining me this evening. We really are excited that you are here with us as we talk a little bit about the power of perception and the skill of composure, which comes from the work of Dr. Becky Bailey, who is the author of Conscious Discipline. She also is a renowned educator and expert in childhood education. Before we dive into these concepts, I do want to just share a little bit about what we discussed last month at our workshop when we talked about the brain states and the 7 skills. I also want to share with those that are watching that this evening's workshop is aligned with what is occurring in our buildings this month, as the focus is the skill of composure. And so not only have our students been introduced to this skill, but our staff have also been introduced to this particular skill of composure. So I am going to share my screen at this time. And we're going to just talk a little bit about the brain model. In this particular work, here we're talking about 3 different states, and this information was shared previously. We're talking about the survival state, the emotional state, and the executive state. With the survival state, what we're looking at is what are some of our triggers? How do we treat those triggers? We're looking at fight, flight, freeze, and surrender. And we're asking ourselves, am I safe? How am I going to respond to different situations? And that part of that survival state stems from the brain stem. As we move down, we shift to the emotional state. Here, we're talking about this unconsciousness. What's happening that's not going my way. We're also looking at behaviors that you might see, which would be attention seeking, relationship resistance, some clinginess, maybe some name calling, and then that social exclusion. As we continue to move down and with that emotional state, we're also talking about that intent of what makes me feel better and what's happening around me as well. When we move to the executive state, that's when we begin to reflect and we want to be able to help. We are in our conscious state, and that's really the state that we want to try to remain when we are responding to our children. Some behaviors that you might see in this particular state is a willingness, some empathy, conflict resolution, problem solving, and really potentially setting some goals. And that's really important when we think about our conscious discipline, and we think about that also in our schools, but also at home. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we dive into the power of perception and the skill of composure. When we shift and we're working with our own children to try to stay and remain in that executive state. I also want to remind those that are watching that there are 3 core components of conscious discipline. First, safety, which really focuses on that self-regulation and the ability to recognize and manage our emotional upset, which we know is very difficult at times. We're also talking about connection, which focuses on creating what we call a compassionate school family culture, where there is that willingness to engage in healthy relationships, and it helps to change our perception about conflict. And then lastly, a core component of conscious discipline is problem solving, which focuses on changing our response to conflict and the ability to then adapt in those situations, which ultimately builds resilience. With these components, everyday events and conflicts become really opportunities for us to teach life skills. And so when we think about this in our schools, this is why we try to work with our students to get them to move from their uh, potentially survival state to their emotional state to their executive state, so that it can become a teachable moment and students can learn from their upsetness.
Well, Ms. Bussey, now that you have reviewed the brain states and the three core components, let's jump right into what is the power of perception and the skill of composure.
All right, awesome. So when we think about the power of perception and the skill of composure, those are really part of the survival state skills, as I had mentioned earlier. Here, the brain is asking, am I safe? Every child needs to feel safe for that optimal learning to really occur. The skill of composure allows us to really see misbehavior as a call for help, versus the opposite, right? Of just a child just doing it to be deliberate. Really, that is a form of communication. And the child, whether it's at school or whether at home, is really asking for help. With composure, we are integrating our brains in a way that allows our prefrontal lobes to do their job of regulating our lower centers. Um, Composure is really the prerequisite skill we as adults need before disciplining children. It is really the key that unlocks the power of perception. And the power of perception reminds us that composure is a choice that we make and that no one really can make us angry without our own permission. Composure also determines our perception, and our perception dictates whether we punish or blame or teach new skills. And as I, think about that and really think about composure and that piece that it determines what we're going to do. If we don't have composure when we are disciplining or trying to redirect skills, what typically will happen is that things will just continue to escalate. And that kind of takes us back to our executive state that I was talking about earlier, and that we really want to function in our executive state so that it can be teachable moments and so that our children can hear us and be able to respond accordingly. As parents and as our parents are watching this, the skill of composure is difficult. You're in the heat of the moment often as a parent. I'm a parent of three wonderful children, of course, right? But there are times where I have actually thought about conscious discipline as I'm interacting with my own children, and knowing that at that moment, I'm not right. I'm not in the best state. I might be functioning in my survival state or my most of the time emotional state. And that if I respond, I may not respond in the way that is a teachable moment, right? So let me give you an example when I talk about composure, and this really happened today. So my son, who is a senior in high school, called me, and he shared with me, he was at open gym for basketball, and he came out and he had a flat tire. And so he's telling me, of course, how this car don't work. I think the Honda works wonderful personally, but he's telling me how horrible this Honda is and that he got a flat tire and he can't believe this is happening and he needs a new car, blah, 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 right? So immediately I feel my pressure rising. Because I'm thinking, really? Like, you have a car that you're able to drive to get you to point A and B. Flat tires happen. And I say to him, you must have ran over something. I didn't run over anything. And so I'm like, you had to run over something, right? And so we're both starting to be in our emotional state, and we're kind of going back and forth. And Miss Thompson, whose office is right next door to mine, says to me, explain to him, because what he wanted to do, he's like, I'm just going to drive it home. And I'm like, you're not driving this car home. It's a flat. You're going to mess up the rim, blah, blah, blah. And Miss Thompson says to me, explain to him why he is not able to drive that car home with that flat tire. And that right there made me pause and kind of shift to my executive state, because we both were functioning kind of in that emotional state of mind. And it became a teachable moment for me, because he's never had a flat tire. He hasn't been driving for not even a year yet. So that's never been experienced for him. And so again, I had to kind of gain my composure with the help of Miss Thompson, of course, and kind of rethink and shift myself so that I can respond in a way that was a teachable moment for my son. So that's just an example, as parenting, things that I'm sure have happened to some of those that are watching as well.
Well, Ms. Bussey, you've given an example of power perception already. That was a great story. I think that's to give those type of examples to help parents, because I'm a parent also. I have a parent of 5. That helps us see how this works. And later on down, as we go on, I actually have a story I'm going to share with you that happened today. So I'll let you go ahead and finish what you're doing, Ms. Bussey, and we'll get to it.
Yeah. So, as I think about different examples of the power of perception, and remember, when we talk about the power of perception, we're talking about how are we perceiving things. And depending on how we are perceiving things, again, is going to determine what our response is, what our behavioral response is. And so let's just say that your children, Mr. Powers, are wrestling, or whoever that's watching, that your children are wrestling on the floor. You are either going to perceive this as they are playing and having fun, or they are fighting. Right?
Yep.
And depending on how you actually perceive them wrestling will determine your behavioral response. So I'm just going to ask you, if you think they are fighting, how would you respond, Mr. Powers?
Oh, I mean, naturally yell, hey, stop that, cut that out.
Right. And that's often the case, right?
Yes,
if we're perceiving that they are fighting, then we probably are going to have a reactional response, and we're going to say or yell, stop fighting, or we're going to run over and we're going to pull our children apart, right? However, if you perceive it as them playing, your response probably is going to look a little different.
Right.
And, you might just say, you know what, you all need to stop playing before somebody gets hurt or somebody gets angry, and then just walk away. Does that make sense? Do you see the difference of those two different perceptions and those different responses? One is more reactive versus the other one is just responding to the situation.
Right. I agree.
So when we think about that, changing our perception really is not easy to do. And in order to change our perception, we must first shift it from and choose between a negative perception or a positive one. And that often happens, in our schools and in our homes. We also have to change from our emotional state from upsetness to being calm. And so when I think about it, I'm sure parents, you can think about times too when you might have perceived a situation differently, and your response is different based on however you are perceiving that particular situation. And so, again, it's the lens in which we are looking at things that will determine the type of response that we're going to have. The same things happen in school, you know. I think you may share later on a situation that may have happened to you and how things were perceived and how, as you shared with me earlier, a young lady had perceived something that was taking place at school. And
Right.
again, how we respond is going to really determine what that outcome looks like. And so in our schools, what we do is we practice STAR. And
Yeah.
STAR helps us to shift from our emotional state back to our executive state so that we can respond and have a teachable moment. And that's just not only a teachable moment for kids, that's a teachable moment for adults too. So STAR stands for smile, take a deep breath, and relax. And this is a quick and easy strategy that can be done at home as well. You know, when you're working with your own children or there's a situation that is occurring and you know that your response might not be the best type of response, that's when we want to pause and we kind of just want to smile, because smiling does allow for us to begin to shift back to that front lobe of our part of our brain, and then breathing. That's really important. I'm sure as parents, you've all had to take a step back and breathe, so that you don't respond in an inappropriate
Right.
way. I often breathe often with teenagers in my life at home, and then really just kind of get a calmness and relax. And we do that in different ways. At school, we use what we call the pretzel method. And so there's different things that our teachers have taught our students to do. And our teachers actually do it as well, because it's important for them to also understand the skill of composure when working with our children, because their reaction, does matter. It definitely matters.
Right. So when we think of the skill of composure, adults who have learned this skill are able to do what?
So really, when the adult understands the skill of composure, they are able to really focus on what they want the child to accomplish. And so they've been able to, again, gain that composure and think about the outcome. So whatever my response is going to be based on whatever I want to really happen to be that outcome, and how I'm going to change, the behavior. They also will be able to utilize connection instead of control as the motivation to behave. And I don't know about you, but I think about even when I was growing up, and not that I had to be disciplined a lot, right? But if I ever was disciplined,
Right.
it was often through fear or through threat. Like, if you don't do something, I'm going to do what, right?
Yep.
And so that's really about punishment versus discipline. And those two things are two different things. Often punishment may not necessarily change a behavior. However, when you're thinking about discipline and you work through that and you talk about it and you're using it as a teachable moment, that's when you're really going to see that impact. That's when you're going to see that change in a child's behavior. They also, if you have been able to gain the skill of composure, you will be able to celebrate a child's successes and their choices. You will also be able to see situations from a child's perspective as well as their own. And so, when the example I gave earlier with my son in the tire, he was experiencing frustration. I didn't necessarily initially start with that skill of composure, but I got to that point with the help of Miss Thompson, bringing me back to my executive state, to be able to really see what was happening from his perspective, so then that I could respond differently to that particular situation. It also with the skill of composure, you will be able to really teach your child how to communicate their desires and frustrations in a socially acceptable manner, right? And so rather than a child throwing a tantrum, you know, you're able to help them respond differently about what their wants and needs may be. And then, really, the last thing that I think about when we think about the skill of composure and um, is that we're able to really hold our children accountable for what we have taught them as we work through dealing with discipline. So I would share with you that we all have triggers as parents. We all have triggers. We have things that make us upset or make us angry. So I just want to take a few minutes, and I want those that are watching and you as well, Mr. Powers, to think about your triggers. What is it that your child may do that pushes buttons?
I got a bunch of them. I got a bunch of them.
I'm sure.
Oh, I got a laundry list of them.
Right? And so our children will push our buttons. Now I want you to think about one time that they pushed your button. And those that are watching, how did you respond? How do you typically respond to that trigger or that button being pushed? Is it that you yell? Do they get a spanking? Do they get punishment? Do they get something taken away? How do you respond to that trigger?
Yeah, all the above. I mean, it's my youngest now is in high school, and there's times where he kind of swells up a little bit, and that's him, trying to become a man. And, those are some things that, those are triggers for me because I don't want to see that, man. I always see him as that little guy, that little boy. So he's a young teenager now. And, there's some things that I have to get in my executive state, get my mind back together and understand what he's going through because I went through it. You know what I mean? I think a lot of times we forget that we were that age as well. You know what I mean? Perfect example. We had a little situation happen today in one of the schools where, we were in the hallway and young lady was giving her friend some candy. But, what we like to do at our schools, we like to keep the flow going. So when the bell rings, we want kids to keep going to class. We don't want them to stop because that is a pile up. We don't want that. So anyway, make a long story short, young lady was giving her friend some candy, and the security guard yelled at her first and said, "Hey, you got to get moving. You got to get moving." Now, she looked at the security guard, kind of gave him this look, gave him this face, and then kind of said something to him. I don't know what she said, but I kind of can figure out it was disrespectful. So I said, "No, you don't say that to him or whatever." And she said something under her breath. I didn't hear it, but she kept walking. Now, the old me, before I started doing conscious discipline, I yelled back. I'm like, "Hey, man, I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy, whatever. I'm in my feelings now. So I'm in my emotional state and survival state. Let's put them all together, right?" So I went downstairs, sat in my office. I started thinking about how we're trying to change things here in SEL. And Ms. Bussey, when me and you had talked, I looked at the conscious discipline book and I started reading it a little bit. And I said, "Man, you know what? I need to apologize to this young lady." Now, I know a lot of parents are looking at it and saying, "What you apologizing for?" Well, there's two reasons. One, I didn't know the young lady very well. I'm new to the district, so I don't know the young lady very well. And as a coach, I remember as a coach that there's so many players that you can yell at from afar. They can handle it. There's some players you got to bring to the side and put your arm around and talk to them because they work better that way. They don't want to be embarrassed. They want to be, it's a different way of coaching. So I look at that the same way. So when I saw that young lady, I went to her classroom, knocked on the door, and she saw me and she didn't want to come to the door. And I said, "Listen, it's only going to take a minute. Just come to the door real quick." So she came to the door and she had her, her demeanor was like, "I'm not talking. I don't want to hear what you got to say, whatever." So she stood against the wall and I had her out in the hallway and I said, "Let me start off by apologizing to you." And as I started to speak to her, I saw all those walls start to melt. because I apologized for one, because I told her I didn't know her very well and I shouldn't have yelled at her. I said, you were doing a great thing for your friend. You were giving your friend some candy. That was a good thing that you were doing. I should have pulled you to the side and let you know why we need you to keep moving. But instead, I started yelling just like the security guard started yelling, and you felt threatened. I apologize for that because I never want you to feel unsafe. And I said, would you accept my apology? And as I started to speak to her, you can see, and I'm telling you, man, this is one of those young ladies that's, it's hard to get through that wall, but you can see her melt. And what I believe happened right there was a trust factor built. There was a respect factor built there because now she sees that I understand how she works and how I could do this better. And then I proceeded to ask her, I was like, how do you think we could have handled this situation differently? And then she even said, you know what, I shouldn't have yelled either. And I was like, you know what, we both, I accept that I was wrong. We could have did some things a little differently. And I thought it went very well, Ms. Bussey. So I think that was practicing conscious discipline. And I can honestly say it worked. But again, I didn't have Ms. Thompson to sit and say, hey, do it right now. But I had to go sit down, take that breath, just kind of relive the moment a little bit and see, put myself in her shoes a little bit and kind of understand what they could be going through as well. Because again, this is more for us than the children, guys, just so you know. So
I would agree with you, Mr. Powers.
Yes.
When we talk about conscious discipline, it is really looking at the adult behaviors and allowing us to then model what we want to see happen, right?
I agree.
Be able to create situations when there are conflicts and learn when there are those conflicts that we are able to then manage the conflicts. And so what you did again was just another teachable moment. And so both you and that young lady that you spoke with this afternoon, it was a win-win type situation.
I agree.
And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the power of perception and, the skill of composure. No one can make you do anything without you giving them permission. And so we talk to our kids about that, but that really goes for us as the adults. No one can make us get out of our hookup unless we give them, that permission. So really, in closing, as we wrap up that skill of composure, and that, like I said, that's something we're going to be talking about for the month of October and the month of November with our students. Composure really creates that safety. It allows us to really be able to communicate with our students and communicate with our own children when we have a sense of composure. And it moves us because remember when I first shared about it, it really functions in that safety piece. Am I safe? And it allows us to kind of move and shift and use it as teachable moments, which we all want. We all want our children to learn from different situations and be able to respond. And so, as we wrap up our short time together, for our parents that are watching, the next time that you may have to discipline your child, think about the skill of composure. Think about pressing pause. Think about taking a deep breath so that when you do respond, it will create a teachable moment. Think about seeing that as a call for help and then how you might be able to then help your child because you're seeing it from their perspective. Conscious discipline is not about not disciplining, but it is shifting from that punishment piece to those teachable moments. So, Mr. Powers, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome.
As we talk about the skill of composure, thank you to those that are watching. I hope that there is at least one small nugget that you were able to take away from this evening's workshop on the power of perception and the skill of composure. And we look forward to seeing you either next month or the following month as we move into the next skill, which is assertiveness. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and I wish everyone well.
Thank you guys for being here.
Have a good evening.